Hello, everyone. A very big thank you for joining us online today for our New Approaches webinar about enabling actions to support cultural access and strengthen creative industries. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Sarah Jane Bennett, and I'm the Director of Policy at A New Approach, or ANA. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands from which we're all joining from today. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be online with us today. So, as you know, 2 weeks ago, ANA released its most recent insight report, Government, Culture and Creativity. It's about more than just funding. So today's webinar is an opportunity to explore this report and to discuss what we discovered about the enabling actions that governments can adopt, in addition to direct cultural funding, to support cultural access and strengthen creative industries. First up, you'll hear from both myself and my colleague, Dr. Sari Rossi. Sari is a researcher at ANA and the lead author of the Enablers Insight report. I'd also really like to take the opportunity to say a huge thank you to anyone and everyone online today who offered their expertise in the development of the Enablers Insight report. And also, if you've had an opportunity to feed into earlier ANA research that led to the creation of the report as well. Um, but before we move into the details of the report, I'd like to introduce you to our work at ANA more generally, particularly those who may be new to our work. ANA is Australia's national arts and culture think tank. As a think tank, our work strives to bridge the gap between knowledge and policy about arts and culture, both here in Australia and beyond. We believe that by 2035, Australia can be a cultural powerhouse whose creativity is locally loved, nationally valued, and globally influential. And making this vision real is at the heart of everything that we do. ANA was initiated by and is entirely supported today by philanthropy, which means we are independent of both government and of industry. But independent, of course, doesn't mean disconnected. For those of you who are familiar with our work at AMA, you may already be aware of our focus group research with everyday Australians. This research we undertook with people aged between 18 and 75 years old from outer suburbs and towns across Australia. And it found that arts and culture is a transformative presence in the lives of people and of communities. So, from this research, we know that arts and culture directly and positively impacts everyday Australians. It's the foundation of communities, transforming daily lives and helping people to live well together. We also know that arts and culture is the highest contributor to community participation, other than spending time with family and friends. Now, why am I telling you this? It's because despite government and household budgets being under pressure, everyday Australians still want to enjoy cultural and creative experiences, and they expect that all levels of government, local, state and territory, and Commonwealth, to help make these experiences accessible. It's also relevant because looking beyond Australia, in 2022, the OECD actually identified that within cultural and creative industries, the role of public finance is shifting from one of direct support to intermediation. Many OECD countries are increasingly focused on enabling actions that make explicit connections between governments, industries, and consumers to complement and enhance direct cultural funding. We began examining this concept of intermediation in our report in 2023 that was called To Scale, which mapped financial inflows in Australian arts, culture, and creativity. And we realised that there was quite a bit more to find out on this topic. So, for these reasons, we decided to produce our insight report on enabling actions that can complement and enhance direct cultural funding. Probably the first and most useful thing to kick off with here is what we actually mean by enablers. So, enablers are the broad range of actions that governments can take to strengthen cultural access and foster robust cultural industries, in addition to direct funding. Direct funding by governments is a crucial and critical part of the overall revenue of organisations in the cultural and creative industries, but it is also relatively well documented. What there is less of an understanding about are the other ways that governments enable arts and culture. Our report makes this important information more visible and accessible across jurisdictions and industries. It's important to note here that many enablers can be no and low cost actions that are importantly uniquely available to governments. And in some cases, enablers may prove themselves to be cheaper, easier, and more effective than direct cultural funding. Specifically, our research identified 8 practical enabler types that governments at all levels, so local, state and territory, and federal, can adopt to facilitate financial inflows, to enhance operations, and to increase engagement. I think also at this stage, it's really important to recognize that this concept or idea of enablers isn't something new, and that there are many governments in Australia already making use of enablers at their disposal. So, the next sensible question might be, what are these 8 types of enablers that were identified in our research? So now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Sari Rossi to walk us through this detail.
Thank you, Sarah Jane, and good afternoon to everybody. So I am going to discuss these 8 types of enablers in a bit more detail, as Sarah Jane highlighted. Before I do this, I just want to give a little bit of context on how we got to these 8 types. One of the questions that we set out to answer when we started this research was what government enablers are currently available outside direct funding to grow and to grow cultural and creative engagement and to strengthen cultural and creative industries. Part 1 of our report focuses on answering this question and provides current examples of enablers at all 3 levels of government. Throughout the development of the process, we refined our understanding of the definition and scope. Essentially, any enablers that included direct funding, this could have been sort of grants or programming or operational funding, for example, these were scoped out. And of the enablers included, we acknowledge that there are or may be different types of costs attached. For example, some no and low cost enablers do have setup costs, maintenance, and training costs attached. And then things like tax concessions, this includes tax deductions, exemptions, and offsets. These all have revenue forgone at costs attached, as I'm sure you're all well aware. And then other types of concessions, this might include non-commercial rates or subsidised and or free admission to institutions. This also results in revenue forgone. So, and then moving on, when answering the question about what government enablers are currently available, our first finding was that all levels of government already do provide a variety of actions to enable cultural and creative activities beyond direct funding mechanisms. We then categorised the enablers that we'd identified into 8 types. And this includes things like fit for purpose and streamlining measures, non-commercial rates, and indirect industry assistance. I'll talk about each of these in detail shortly. But before I do that, I just want to highlight something that became really evident to us is that the enablers appeared to have 3 main functions. The first function being facilitating financial inflows, this being new money coming in, and includes enablers that facilitate investment. One example here is deductible gift recipient status to incentivize donations. or through compensation mechanisms. For example, mechanisms for collecting fees and distributing royalties. The other example here is enablers that can help to grow business income. Examples here include procurement policies. The second function is facilitating operations. We also like to say enhancing operations here. And this is achieved either with measures that build capacity and capability or with measures that increase access to resources and infrastructure, or any kind of enablers that reduce business expenses. The third function is enablers that increase engagement opportunities. And this really includes anything that facilitates access, participation, and inclusion in various different ways. Next, I'll talk through some of the examples with those 8 types and highlight the function for some of them as well. Okay, so the first example is fit for purpose and streamlining measures. Examples here include things like one-stop shops and pre-approved plans. These were largely identified at the local government level and in some instances state and territory level as well. Anything that really reduces the red tape delays. And these were largely facilitating operations. Another example here is procurement guidelines and principles, which were found at all levels of government and speaks to one way that governments do leverage purchasing power. And as mentioned, this is one way to facilitate financial inflows. The next type is legislation, regulations, and standards. Here I want to highlight that, and this may seem self-evident, but many of the other types of enablers also have connected legislation and regulation. I'm not going to go into detail about this other than to say that I really like to refer to the various underpinning legislation and regulation as the enablers of the enablers. For the next example, skills, career pathways, and knowledge sharing. This includes things like training and advisory services, for example, capability building workshops. These were identified at all levels of government. And the other example here is collecting and publishing data, and again was identified at all levels of government to various degrees. And both of these enhance overall operations at the very least. I'm sure they can do much more than that. Okay, the fourth is facilitating co-investment and collaboration. Examples here include partnerships, which we identified at all levels. Partnerships is one of those interesting ones where I think it can speak to any of those functions. So depending on the specific context of the partnership, it might bring in extra financial inflows. It can enhance operations. It can increase engagement opportunities. The other example here that I wanted to highlight is participation or that kind of creative industries expertise to shape relevant government policies, for example, advisory groups or co-design approaches. And one way that you can look at these is that they can increase engagement opportunities, really having people involved that have lived experience of something was found to be really valuable. Okay, moving on to non-commercial rates. This can include, any kind of free or reduced costs to access a range of government-owned or managed assets. Typically, these are understood to enhance operations by reducing business expenses. And in some cases, these measures may also increase engagement opportunities. For example, offering free parking at certain times to increase affordability, which in turn increases access to cultural offerings. These were also examples of non-commercial rates were found at all levels of government. Okay, moving on to indirect industry assistance. This includes a range of industry-focused tax concessions and copyright, both of which are enabled by underpinning legislation. And most of these examples are at that federal level, but we did identify relevant tax concessions also at the state and territory level. Information promotion and marketing. One examples here include streamlined information, promotion, and marketing campaigns, all of which increase engagement opportunities. And finally, the last type is special consideration for eligibility and exemptions. And one of the examples I wanted to pull out here is eligibility of any kind of cultural or creative event activities in existing voucher schemes. For example, we identified that voucher schemes for children we had a look at all the states and territories, and almost all jurisdictions provide ones that there are some options for creative activities alongside sport and other types of recreation. Before I hand back to Sarah Jane, I just want to touch on an observation which we have articulated as an opportunity. So, while some of the enablers may seem obvious, when we looked at all levels and across jurisdictions, identifying the uptake of the enablers was really tricky. So, to maximize learning potential about enablers, we've included an opportunity in the report that existing data collection mechanisms could be adjusted to include a question about enablers beyond currently reported expenditure. Okay, now I'm going to hand back to Sarah Jane to highlight some of the other opportunities identified by the report.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sari. That's a very helpful segue into the opportunities outlined in the report. So for those of you who may have already had an opportunity to jump into the publication, you'll see that part two of the report is focused on exploring what else governments could be doing. And it does this by drawing on international examples and research, and also by highlighting trends and opportunities that exist to enable arts and culture. It looks at ideas as well of enablers that might sit outside of the general boundaries of domestic cultural policy. And in particular, it looks at five different focus areas. So those areas are access, infrastructure, innovation, production, and protection. So we're just going to jump through a couple of examples for these ones here. Now, access as a focus area is about how easily the community can obtain a good or service, whether that's physical, digital, or virtual, and what enablers could be used to support this. So in part two, you'll see, for example, enabler that could be explored is increasing access to data that provides more detailed information about certain population groups, for example, that could then better inform decisions about planning, about zoning, and about accessibility needs. When we talk about infrastructure as a focus area, we're looking at opportunities for physical, digital, and cultural structures and facilities to make sure that cultural arts and cultural opportunities are available to the community, and there's appropriate infrastructure that's supporting it at a policy level as well. On that point, one of the examples that we've got in the paper is the creation of an Australian Cultural Relations Institution as an enabler of soft power diplomacy. The third focus area that we look at is innovation, and this considers how enablers can be used to create new ideas, methods, or forms, and to see these actually diffused across the economy. Again, in part two of the Insight report, some examples of enablers we've considered here are those in the recent OECD research. So the use, for example, of research and development tax credits, as well as mechanisms to generate collaboration and partnerships, such as cross-sectoral networks, clusters, co-working spaces, and other forms of incubators. The fourth area that we look at in part two is around production, and this explores what could be done to enable the act of producing, creating, or manufacturing goods or services. One example that came up here was in the UK in relation to their creative industry tax reliefs and expenditure credits. Now, this allows qualifying corporations to claim deductions on expenditures that are directly related to producing and developing various arts and cultural outputs, including films, video games, and museum and gallery exhibitions. And finally, the fifth focus area that part two looks at is protection. Protection works through how enablers could be used to safeguard tangible and intangible goods and services. Here, interestingly, you'll see in the Insight report that we found that Australia has already been internationally recognised for its protection enablers. So, for example, UNESCO has highlighted Australia's standardised guidance and toolkit in taking climate action for World Heritage properties. We've also been recognised for our expansion of lending rights to cover digital formats such as ebooks and audiobooks. So this is a great opportunity here for governments to promote these existing tools, both within industry and internationally. Now, ultimately, the Insight report identifies the opportunities available to government to play to their strengths and responsibilities when designing and expanding pro-culture enablers. What this means is working across policy portfolio boundaries and looking at the arts and culture system to see what enablers might work best in what situations. We've got two specific ways identified, two opportunities that we believe supports this. So opportunity one is establishing a ministerial council of cultural ministers, which would include a seat for a representative of Australian local governments, and that this would have a role in strengthening collaboration and knowledge sharing across jurisdictions. The other opportunity to highlight here is developing a consistent approach to evaluating pro-culture enablers to help inform decision making and action across jurisdictions by strengthening the evidence base for what works well in what contexts. You'll be happy to know that Australia is also, ANA is also undertaking further work to support governments to do this work well. In particular, we know that working across portfolio boundaries and outside traditional policy areas means understanding arts and culture as a system. And we are currently researching the arts, culture, and creativity system in Australia through a number of different angles, including the questions of what is the arts and culture system? What does it include? How is it organised? And how is it governed? And what can we measure in this system? We also are looking at how the arts and culture system in Australia compares to its sports counterpart. Now, our primary purpose in this ongoing systems research project is to help ensure that Australia is a great place for creators and audiences, that it has strong processes and structures for cultural and creative practice and product delivery, which then support Australia's national prosperity, cohesion, health, security, and sustainability. Alongside this research and following the focus of the Enablers Insight report on what governments are currently doing and what they could be doing, we're now moving on to look at the question of what should governments be doing with pro-culture enablers. At this point, it's probably just a very big thank you for taking the time to join us today and to hear a little bit more about the work that we've had going on at A New Approach. As always, if you've got any questions or feedback or insights or comments to share, please do get in touch with us at hello@newapproach.org.au. And thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to hear from you soon.